Now, the most famous person in the book of Judges is without a question the hero Samson. Samson is about as close to a comic book character as you can find in all of the Bible. He is blessed by God with superhuman strength, and he slaughters the Philistines in record numbers because God has made him so strong. Now, of course, because this is a comic book almost like story, he also has a weakness, which is his hair. And if you cut his hair, he loses his strength, which you can see where this is going. He will lose his strength eventually. Now, you may have grown up hearing this story all the time. You may have never heard this story before, but Samson is without a doubt the most famous person in the book of Judges. Today, though, I must tell you that I find someone else in the book of Judges to be more compelling than Samson. Now, this woman is someone who is close to Samson. It is Samson's mother, and her story is told in Judges 13. Now, Samson's mother does not receive a lot of depictions within artwork, and it's hard to find pieces of art that actually show what she looked like or what artists imagine her to look like. So with that, I had the artist Crystal Chavez imagine what this woman might look like, and this is what Crystal came up with. Now, in the text, she is referred to one of two ways. The first way that she is referred to the wife of Manoa. The second way is the mother of Samson. She does not receive a name in the text. However, in the rabbinic tradition, the rabbis feel that she is too important to ignore, so they have offered a name, and they came up with a name for her, which is the name Zlelponith. Let me hear you say Zlelponith this morning. So to honor the rabbinic tradition, we will refer to this woman as Zlelponith for the rest of this sermon. Now, Zlelponith's story is told in Judges 13, and there is one verb that is intimately connected to who she is and what she does. That is the Hebrew verb yashab. Let me hear you say yashab this morning. Now, yashab is the most important verb in the story for Zlelponith, and it's important that we make note of it. Because this verb, yashab, ultimately reveals that it's not just her son who has a superpower, but Zlelponith herself also possesses a superpower. And to understand what her superpower is, you have to understand what yashab is. And I will tell you eventually, but I want us to read the story and see the whole thing before we talk about what this verb actually means. So with that, let's begin in Judges chapter 13, verse 2, where we read, "There was a certain man of Zorah," and Zorah is a real place. Now, this blue star is where Jerusalem is. Most people know that Jerusalem is in Israel. To the west of Jerusalem is a place that is known as Zorah. That is where this story unfolds. Now, this certain man was not just any man. He was a member of the tribe of the Danites. Now, the author assumes that you and I know who the Danites are, so let me just bring you up to speed real quick. Well before this story occurred, there was a man named Jacob who later changed his name to Israel. Now, Jacob/Israel had 12 different children with 4 different women, and the 5th oldest of his sons was a man named Dan. So, Jacob had 12 sons. These became the 12 fathers of the tribes of the 12 tribes of Israel, and the 5th tribe was known as the tribe of Dan. So this is a man who grew up descending from the man named Dan. Now, we are introduced to this man in the very next line where we hear that his name is Manoa. And Manoa is the father of Samson. We then read his wife, and then I've added this part, Zlelponith, was barren, having borne no children. Now, if you're like me, you're tempted to just read on to the next verse, but we have to stop and empathize a little bit here with Zlelponith and Manoa. Perhaps in your own marriage or in your own life, you and your partner have faced the daunting task of barrenness. You know this is a lonely and a difficult road. You know that this is a tragic event. And so when we read these words, we should not become so numb or callous that we just quickly move on. We should sit in the uncertainty of what it must be like for being a couple who lives in a season of barrenness. This is a tragic story, and it begins on this note of emptiness. Now, the next verse then takes away from Manoa and adds to the story of Zlelponith when she is by herself. She is doing something, and then all of a sudden, an angel appears. Now, I don't know about you, but I like to imagine how I might react if I literally saw an angel standing in front of me. I'm pretty sure it would be something like this. It would be a little jumpy, wouldn't it? And so Zlelponith sees an angel. And the angel shows up and says just a few things to her. The angel says, although you are barren, having borne no children, you shall conceive and bear a son. In the very next verse, the angel then says, here's some instructions for how to raise this son. And after the instructions are given, the angel disappears. Now, it's not just difficult to process an angel showing up, but you also have to process the whole idea that you are now with child and things are very different for you now. As soon as you start to think about that, though, there's another problem that we have here because the angel just suddenly disappears. How would you react if this happened to you? Because if I was Zlelponith, I'd be like, oh, wow, I got to write something down. I got to tell someone. So she runs to her husband, Manoa. And when you read the verse with this much energy, you can see that she's trying to process everything that just happened, and there's just like this life that jumps off the page. She goes to Manoa, and she's like, a man of God came to me, and his appearance was like that of an angel of God, most awe-inspiring. I did not ask him where he came from, and he did not tell his name. But you know what he said to me, Manoa? He said, you shall conceive and bear a son. And she hugs her husband and says, we're gonna have a baby. Manoa seems indifferent to this news. In the very next verse, he leaves Zlelponith behind and says, let's have a real chat with God, man to man, or so he thinks. And he goes to his knees and he says, oh Lord, I pray, let the man of God whom you sent come to us again and teach us what we are to do concerning the boy who will be born. Now, if you're like me, you read this part of the verse and you say to yourself, I don't think Manoa believes his wife. It's almost like he's saying to God, like, hey, God, this involves two of us. Wouldn't it be more convenient if you showed up to both of us so we could verify each other's story? Now, I want God to show up and put Manoa in his place, but God has an even better sense of humor because we hear that God listened to Manoa and the angel of God came again to Zlelponith by herself, may I add, and we read, as she yashabed in the field, but her husband Manoa was not with her. Now it's here that Zlelponith looks at the angel and says, okay, I know you disappeared before, stay right here, please. She runs to her husband Manoa. She's like, hey, angel, it's back, come quickly. Manoa starts running. He gets back to the spot where the angel is, and this time he sees the angel for himself. But you can almost feel him push Zlelponith aside as he speaks to the angel directly. Now, this angel is a celestial being who probably has infinite knowledge, and here he has the opportunity to ask any question he possibly can think of to someone who knows more about reality than he could ever hope to know. And the question Manoa comes up with is, are you the man who spoke to this woman? The second question he comes up with is, can you verify what you said to this woman? Because I'm really having a hard time believing her, and you could really clear some things up now. It's almost like Manoa is saying, did this literally happen? And the angel kind of rolls their eyes at Manoa and says, yes, it literally happened. And his response is, I don't know if it did. Now, if I was the angel, I would respond by thinking, then why did you ask these questions? What was this whole point? Yes, it happened. Oh, you still don't think so? Why ask it then? Now he goes on, and Manoa gets just downright weird at this point. He says to the angel, please, allow us to detain you. What? Now the angel gives an equally weird response, because I believe the angel is just messing with Manoa at this point, because the angel says, if you detained me, I couldn't eat your food, like you do. And then he goes on to say, what's your name? And the angel says, oh, why do you ask my name? Because it is too wonderful to tell you. After that, Manoa and Zlelponith light a fire, and instantly, the angel disappears. Now, here's what's interesting. The text says, the angel of the Lord did not appear again to Manoa and his wife. And once Manoa realized the angel wasn't coming back, it was at that moment that he realized it was actually an angel of the Lord. Now, once he realizes that, he all of a sudden looks inward and he sees a tremendous amount of fear. He says out loud, "We're gonna die. Oh my gosh, God's gonna kill us." And Zlelponith says, "Calm down. We're not gonna die. If God wanted us dead, we'd probably already be dead." And then after she says that, we read that she conceives a son, gives birth to him, and she names him Samson. And the story of Judges 13 comes to a close, and that is the end of Zlelponith's story. Now, when we read this today, most Christians view this story as a kind of flyover story, right? Like, hey, we're just trying to get to the story of Samson. That's the real famous story. That's the one everyone likes to talk about. There's lots of violence and superhero stuff in that story. We just need this to kind of give some background, right? But if you look at this story and you take the story of Zlelponith seriously, you may ask yourself a question. Does this story actually matter? Or is it a footnote in another man's story? So you would do what most Christians would do. You would go to a pastor and you would say, "Pastor, can you help me understand Judges 13 and why it's important?" And most pastors I know would say, "Well, of course I can, because every story in the Bible is important, right?" They would read through it with you, and then they would look and they would say, "Oh, this is why this story is important." It's a bit of a test for you and me. The most important question we can ask after reading Zlelponith's story is, do I or do you believe Zlelponith's story? Now you may say, "Oh, I don't really understand. What do you mean believe Zlelponith's story?" And the pastor would say, you have to literally believe that this is a historical event. That's why this story exists. You have to believe that angels actually spoke to Zlelponith, and if you don't, then you will have a weaker faith, because the highest form of faith is believing in the stories as they occurred. And at that point, you may say to yourself, "Really? What is it exactly that I have to believe?" And the pastor would say, let me just put it this way. Let me ask you this question. Do you believe that a literal angel visited Zlelponith and spoke to her, and that these words in the Bible can be trusted as an accurate historical record? Because this tests you to see if you literally believe that this occurred. Now, if this doesn't quite sit right with you, I will tell you it doesn't sit right with me either. Because you know who this sounds like? It sounds exactly like Manoa. Manoa, who saw an angel and could have asked him anything about how stars work, for crying out loud, right? And instead, he's like, "I'm having a hard time believing this woman. Can you just verify this?" And Manoa goes through all of the motions, and as soon as this angel, he realizes an angel and actually believes his wife, his response is, "We're gonna die. Oh my gosh, the angels are near. We're all gonna die." I have a question for you this morning. Does Manoa act admirably in this story? Is Manoa a role model of faith? Is Manoa someone that we should strive to be like? In my opinion, the answer is no. Which raises the question, why does the church strive to be Manoa in this story? Why does the church want to be the one that's like, "Did this really happen? I mean, if a woman said it, maybe we should hold the phone there for a second. Maybe we should pump the brakes. We should all see, if we all are on the same page, that there was a literal angel that actually showed up." When you start to see that Manoa is a representation of larger organized religion, you all of a sudden say, "Oh, now I get this question. Please allow us to detain you." Churches love to do this. If you don't believe me, I recently was driving around and I saw a sign on a church's front line that said, "Experience God's changing power." I was like, amen. Yes, we should all strive to experience God's changing power, and we should move from a system of belief to a system of experience. That's the right thing. But then I looked closer at the sign, and below these big letters that said this thing, it said, "Sundays at 10 a.m. and Wednesdays at 6 p.m. God's changing power apparently exists for 2 out of 168 hours a week. Can you imagine standing up there and being like, "Come to church to meet God on the weekend at 11. Experience God's changing power between these hours when we're together, that's it? Is that the point of what church is? Church loves to try and capture angels, transcendent experiences, mystical wonders, and say they all happen here in our doors at these hours. Then Manoa asks the angel, "What is your name?" And can I tell you, I love the angel's response. "Why do you ask my name? It is too wonderful for words." A few years ago, I had the privilege and honor of holding my son for the very first time. And if any parent here has experienced this, then you know that this moment is hard to describe. But imagine that someone came up to me shortly after December 12, 2016 and said, "Craig, I heard you had a son." I would say, "I did." And they looked at me and they leaned in close and they say, "Can you tell me what it was like to hold him for the very first time?" And imagine if I said back to them, "Yeah, I can tell you. Just get a bag that weighs 7 pounds, 7 ounces, and hold it." It's the exact same thing. Now, at that point, you would say, "I think you've misunderstood the question or the entire point of life." So let's imagine that Manoa says, "Hey, angel, what's your name?" And the angel says, "It's Gary." Manoa then goes around and says, "I met an angel, his name's Gary. He likes to golf. I know a lot about angels." But the fact that the angel said, no, you can't know the angels' names. It is too wonderful for words. It implies that there is a limit to language in the way that we experience transcendent moments, isn't there? Transcendent moments like when I held my son for the first time. Eventually, if somebody asks me, "What was it like to hold your son for the first time?" the only thing I can really say that works is, you kind of had to be there. I don't know how else to describe it. A major temptation of religion, all religious people, including this church, including this pastor, a major temptation of religion is to assign names to things that are unnameable because it is a way of domesticating the infinite. It is a way of owning that which was never intended to be owned. So when religion comes along and says, "Oh, do you believe Zlelponith's story this morning? Do you believe Zlelponith's story occurred in this way?" There is an attempt to own it, to say, clearly God can only happen in these parameters, and we need to know if you're on board with those parameters or not. But when you look at this question, you think to yourself, I don't know, I've never had an angel show up in my life. I've never had an angel like Zlelponith had in this story. It's kind of hard for me to believe it happened this exact way. I want you to know that if you've thought those things, I feel you. I've been there, and I get that. In fact, that ultimately points to the question we should be asking after this story, not this one. That's Manoa's question, right? The question we should be asking is, have you experienced Zlelponith's story? Have you lived through it? And if your response is, "No, I just told you, I haven't ever been visited by an angel," I would say, "Oh, I've been there too." But let's go back to that Hebrew verb, yeshab, and talk about what happens in this moment. Because this is where the substance of the story is found. Now, I told you earlier that Zlelponith had superpowers. And we are a culture that loves superpowers. We go out in droves to the theaters to see Marvel movies, right? So you're like, great, superpowers. I can't wait to hear what Zlelponith did. And obviously, it's a very impressive superpower because it summons angels, apparently. So what is it that she's doing here with the Hebrew verb yashab that ultimately brings an angel about in our lifetime and in this story? We read that and we think, oh, okay, maybe she's her son has got super strength, so probably she was very strong as well. Maybe she's out in the field working out. Maybe that's what she's doing, and she's just building her strength even further. And you would say, you know what would make this story really cool? It's not if she was just working out, but if she levitated off the ground. That would be a very impressive story indeed. What about if she turned invisible in the field? We could get a story about that. And whatever it is, that Yashab must be severely impressive in order to bring about angels. And to talk about what Yashab is, I want to tell you about a movie that I recently saw that I think is fantastic. It's called The Sound of Metal. Now, this movie came out just a few months ago, and it's about a drummer in a metal band who starts to lose his hearing and then in turn starts to lose all groundings of his identity. The main character here is Reuben, played by Riz Ahmed. And Riz Ahmed is a recovering addict who is getting back on the right path with his drum career and with his metal band, and things are looking good until he starts to lose his hearing, and then he has a relapse. His girlfriend, Lou, depicted here, calls around and she finds a shelter for people who are deaf and recovering addicts. She drives into this shelter and they meet the director of the shelter, a man named Joe. And Joe is able to speak to Reuben by using a machine that transcribes what he's saying and then reading the lips of what Reuben says back to him. Now Lou leaves Reuben at the shelter with Joe, and Reuben and Joe start to have more and more interesting conversations. The third or fourth conversation they have, they sit down at this machine, and Joe says to Reuben, I've got a little assignment for you, Reuben, okay? You get up early, right? And Reuben says, yeah, I get up pretty early, yeah. And Joe says, I'll have hot coffee waiting for you at 5:30. Is that early enough for you? Now, Reuben at this point is unimpressed. He rolls his eyes and he says, I don't know, sure, I guess. Joe says, okay then, 5 in the morning. And I'll provide a room for you. Now this brings some mild intrigue to Reuben and his life, because he looks at him and he says, what for? Joe goes on to say, there's nothing that needs to be accomplished in this room. All I want you to do, Reuben, is just, and then he makes the sign, sit. That's all I want. All I ask is if and when you cannot just sit, you turn yourself to the pen and paper that I'm going to supply for you, and I want you to write. Now, Reuben, it doesn't matter what you write or how you write, whether it's spelled correctly or if it's just a big mess. I don't care. No one is going to read it, okay? But Reuben, I want you to keep writing continuously without stopping until you feel like you can sit again. Now, Reuben is completely confused by this process, but he starts the next day attempting to sit. And while he is a novice, we return to the story of Zlelponith and the Hebrew verb yashab, which is to sit. And we read that Zlelponith sat in the field when the angel showed up to her. My friends, Zlelponith's superpower is sitting. Now, it's here that you may say, Craig, sitting is not a superpower. I can do sitting. Sitting isn't special. It's not super and it's not powerful. It's not a superpower. And you may say to yourself, I don't get what this guy is doing. Do you realize how dumb of a superhero someone who sat down would be? Would anybody watch that movie? Imagine if they made that movie about a superhero who just sat. Would that be a terrible movie or a great movie? But I would disagree with you. And I would say, oh, it's a great movie. And you may say, how do you know, Pastor Craig? And I would say, because I've already seen it. It's called The Sound of Metal. And while some say it's about a drummer who is going deaf, I would say to you, it's about a human being who is learning how to sit. And you may look at me skeptically and say like, well, how good is it? And I would say 97% good. Is that enough, you would say? And I would say, how about 2 Oscars in your face? Some hefty nominations as well. And there's this moment in the film, at the end of the film, when Reuben has left the shelter and he's come back. And he's been doing a lot of soul searching, and he's coming more and more to the conclusion that life is meaningless, that life is pointless. And he returns to Joe, and he loses it. He says, like, what does it matter, Joe? What does it matter? All of this is just pointless. It passes. Yo, if I disappear, Joe, like, who cares? Honestly, nobody cares. Seriously, yo, and that's okay. That's life. That's life. No, for real, okay? It just passes. It just freaking passes. When I saw this scene, I want you to know that I really resonated with what Ruben was saying because I've been there too. And Joe hears all of it. He sits there for a moment. He doesn't argue with Ruben, but instead he says to him, I wonder, Ruben, all these mornings, you've been sitting in my study, sitting. Have you had any moments of stillness? Because you're right, Ruben. The world does keep moving, and it can be a damn cold place. There's a long pause before the next line. And then Joe says, but for me, those moments of stillness, that place, Ruben, that's the kingdom of God. Now, I was watching this by myself, and I looked around, and I was like, am I watching a Christian movie? The kingdom of God is Jesus' preferred metaphor for all things good in the direction that God is leading all of the universe. And here in this movie that is just talking about metal drummers, all of a sudden slips in there this idea to talk about the value of stillness. They're like, let's use that metaphor that's 2,000 years old from a carpenter on the other side of the world. And I use the word metaphor intentionally because it's not like Joe says, oh, I sit still and then a new kingdom opens up and I pay taxes to different leaders and there's a governance system. It's great. It's way better over there. This, my friends, this is a metaphor. To call this a literal kingdom of God would be a mistake. And when we go back to Zlelponith's story, we have to remember that we're transcending time by millenniums. And Zlelponith is visited by an angel while she sits in a field. And this angel, my friends, this is a metaphor. She sits in the stillness in the same way that a metal drummer is attempting to sit in the stillness in a movie thousands of years later. And the way the author of Judges describes this is an angel came to her while she sat. Joe describes it as the kingdom of God is found in the stillness. And while you may be hearing this and start thinking skeptical thoughts, one of the most well-known verses in all of the Bible and least practiced is from the psalmist in Psalm 46 when the psalmist writes, "Be still and know that I am God." Here's what's just mind-boggling to me. The psalmist wrote this before they had iPhones. The psalmist wrote this before they had Teslas. The psalmist wrote this before they had Netflix. And yet the psalmist is looking around at people and saying like, we are too busy. We are too obsessed. We are too distracted. And he wrote this, she wrote this, we don't know who wrote this. This person wrote this all of these thousands of years ago and said, hey, you want to find God? Why don't you sit in the stillness and discover that God is there? And when we look at Zlelponith's story, and the fact that her superpower was the fact that she had learned how to sit while her husband clearly hadn't. The question I want to ask you this morning is, have you experienced Zlelponith's story? Have you sat in the stillness? And if you are atheist or agnostic, I'm not asking you to believe anything that you can't prove. That's not what this is about. Instead, it's merely sitting in stillness and seeing that there's all of these humans who have come before from multiple faith traditions who have said there's something sacred about sitting in silence. Now, if you would have asked me just a few months ago, Craig, have you experienced Zlelponith's story? I would have told you, yeah, I think so, maybe not really. I've had a troubled time sitting in stillness. I've tried all sorts of things. I've listened to all sorts of people. I've tried waking up early to stare at candles. I've tried going to bed late and doing the stillness in the nighttime. I've tried all sorts of different methods, and none of them have really worked. I do it for 1, 2, or 3 days before it becomes a drag, and I say, this isn't worth it. But then something happened a few weeks ago. And to talk about what happened a few weeks ago, we have to go back even more than that to several years ago, because my wife and I, when we were engaged, we just couldn't help ourselves. We couldn't wait. We got a dog out of wedlock, and her name was Bella. And this dog has been a part of our marriage from day one. And what that means is every morning since I've been married, I woke up early and walked this dog for an average of 2 miles, somewhere between 4, 5, or 6 days a week. This was very much my morning routine, was walking with Bella. And if you know me, you know that 6 weeks ago, due to an abdominal mass, my wife and I had to say goodbye to Bella, and we put her down. She was a great dog, and it's just even hard to describe just what she meant to our family. She was just great with kids, and I will always be grateful she was part of our family. And we cried all day, we cried all weekend, and then Monday rolled around, and I remember I woke up early out of habit, and I became overcome with a sense of profound sadness, because this was the first weekday that I wasn't walking with my dog. And I woke up, and I coped with that sadness the way that most of us cope with that sadness today. I opened my phone and began scrolling endlessly for hours. And I want to really emphasize that it was hours, 2 hours until it was time to go to work, and then I could just start working. This happened for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, a week. I would wake up very early and then just start scrolling through my phone, looking for something. After 2 weeks, I said to myself, you know what, this has got to stop. At the very least, I'm just going to wake up and watch a movie so that way I can say, I've watched a movie this morning. Isn't that great? So there was one Sunday, I woke up early out of habit, and I was like, I heard Sound of Metal was great. I'm going to do it. I watched Sound of Metal. It completely wrecked me. We got to that scene that I shared with you, and I was like, I have got to learn how to sit in stillness. And I listened to their whole technique, which was, get a pad of paper and a pen. It'll cost you $5.99. You go and you sit down and you try your best to welcome every thought. You write it down, and then you see what happens as you try to learn how to sit. So the next morning, I did it. I sat down outside, and I began to write. I stayed in silence for an hour, and then went about my day. The next day, I did the same thing. Woke up early, sat down, wrote about the day, wrote about all my thoughts. The next day, the same thing. This happened 3 days in a row, 4 days in a row. After the 4th day, I went to bed looking forward to that moment the next day for the first time in my life. Now, I'm telling you this morning that I was sitting there in the silence, sitting there in the stillness, and I remember looking around from my front porch and thinking to myself, Redlands is really pretty. It's really great being here. And when I wake up in the morning, I wake up right when the birds are getting active. And I listen to them sing for an hour. There was one morning I woke up and there was just a cricket making noise. I couldn't hear another cricket, and I wondered to myself, is this cricket singing just for me right now? And I just sat and listened to that cricket's song. And if you know me, you know that I have a lot of anxiety about the declining state of our environment. We are in a climate crisis, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I feel like there's so much action that needs to be done. But after doing this ritual for the past 3 weeks, you know what else I realized? I wasn't making any time to sit and enjoy creation. And while I still have a low-level anxiety about the climate crisis, I have to tell you, at least I'm making time to enjoy it now. And I've written a lot of gibberish. I filled up a journal. It's nothing coherent. It doesn't matter. It's all spelled wrong. But I'm telling you, the number one phrase that keeps ending up on the page is this: I love it here. I love it right here in Redlands, with my kids the ages they are, in the house that I'm in. I love it here. I know it's not impressive to tell you I've done a ritual for 3 weeks. But I have to tell you, in just those 3 weeks, I'm trying to figure out life just like all of you. And in those 3 weeks, if you were to ask me, how has this ritual changed you? I would say it has made me much more aware of grace. It's truly a gift to be alive. And if these words seem silly to you, I'll tell you they sound silly to me coming out of my mouth, because what I am trying to describe is what I would say is unnameable. I'm speaking to you this morning to tell you that this may not work for you. I'm speaking to you this morning to tell you that you may be a night person and not a morning person, and that's fine. But all I could say to you is that it is worth it. It is absolutely worth it to try and sit in the stillness, to try different ways of sitting in the stillness, because this life is too precious, too holy, too sacred to miss out on. And while there are difficult seasons that we all face, there is also this sense that we are ultimately loved and can give a little bit of love back to the world. So no matter how much you are trying to figure things out, I would encourage you to keep trying to sit in the stillness in the way that Joe was telling Reuben in the movie Sound of Metal. I would encourage you to try to sit in the stillness in the way that the psalmist said, you want to know God? Sit still and you will know. I'm encouraging you to try to sit in the stillness like Zlelponith, a woman who is often overlooked and forgotten because what she taught us how to do was to sit. My friends, may you sit in stillness and experience the unnameable. That is my prayer for you this morning. Amen.